Hello. In this lecture, we want to take a look at the uh, chapter 9, which focuses on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This chapter can be thought of as a kind of a glorified version of chapter 3, whereas in chapter 3 we looked at uh, demand and supply as it pertained to an individual market. So the techniques we learned about, the mechanics that we focused on in chapter 3 are going to show up in this chapter. It's just they're going to be more intense. They'll be at the economy level. So the focus of this chapter is looking at kind of the mechanics of the economy. And since the economy is a collection of all markets, it makes sense that the mechanical features of this chapter should be very similar to the mechanical features that we discussed in chapter 3 when we looked at the mechanics of a market. So this chapter should be very reminiscent of things that we've done before in chapter 3. So I'm going to proceed through it rather quickly because there are some very obvious similarities that hopefully will become apparent very quickly. Alright, so we're going to look at aggregate demand, aggregate supply theory as it pertains to the economy. Again, the economy, just like a market, has two sides. A market has a demand side, a market has a supply side. And since the economy is the collection of all markets, we can say that the economy has an aggregate demand side, which will look at the demand for all goods and services, because we're combining all markets together. And it also has an aggregate supply side, which looks at all collective production activity in the economy by sellers. So just like a market has a demand side and a supply side, the economy has an aggregate demand side and an aggregate supply side. And we're going to take a look briefly at the activities on both the aggregate demand side, then we'll look at the aggregate supply side, and then we'll put the pieces together and study how the economy works mechanically. Alright, so let's start with the aggregate demand side. On the aggregate demand side, you have the aggregate demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve can be thought of as taking all buyers of all products in all markets and combining all that demand activity together. And you get this kind of resulting super demand curve that we call the aggregate demand curve. So the aggregate demand curve is simply taking all individual demand curves and grouping them together, aggregating them. And it's depicted as being downward sloping, like the demand curves we saw in chapter 3 in an individual market. So it's like taking all individual downward sloping demand curves and meshing them together and getting this composite demand curve that we call the aggregate demand curve. And I'm going to label it with AD, and AD will refer to aggregate demand. Now, a couple cosmetic things to notice. On the vertical axis here, I have price level, and price level is like an average of all prices. So if I'm combining demand curves for different products that have different prices, I need some way to represent the price movements for all those products. And so price level can be thought of as the average of all prices. On the horizontal axis, I have real GDP. And the reason why I focus on real GDP is real GDP puts the spotlight on quantities. If you remember from the chapter 5 discussion of GDP, real GDP puts the spotlight clearly on quantities. And so since I'm looking at all goods and services, I need something to represent the quantities of all goods and services, and I'm going to use real GDP. So on the vertical axis we have price level, tracking the behavior of all prices on average. And on the horizontal axis we have real GDP, capturing all the quantities in the economy. Alright. Now, from the aggregate demand curve, we can then proceed to the aggregate supply side of the economy. And the aggregate supply curve is interesting in the sense that It's upward sloping in part like we'd expect, but at some point it becomes vertical. So you can think of the aggregate supply curve in general as all sellers of all products in all markets. So it's reflecting the behavior of all sellers of all products in all markets. So look at all that production collectively. Again, I have on the axis price level, I have on the horizontal axis real GDP for the reasons I just explained for the aggregate demand curve. Now, why the aggregate supply curve is both upward sloping and then becoming vertical can be thought of this way. On this upward sloping part, which I'm referring to as short run aggregate supply, so SRS refers to short run aggregate supply. As you move from point to point on this curve, real GDP down below will change. If I move up the curve, real GDP is increasing. If I move down the curve, real GDP is decreasing. And the reason for that is because of scarcity in the economy. When sellers produce more output, that is when real GDP goes up, the available resources become even more scarce. So it's like we're working from a limited amount of resources. And so when you use more resources, the resources that remain become less plentiful. And as they become less plentiful, their costs go up and prices start to rise. So as you're moving up the short run aggregate supply curve, the price level goes up in response to those resources becoming more constrained, and eventually at some point you use all the resources. So where the aggregate supply curve goes from upward sloping to vertical corresponds to what we call full employment, the full employment level of real GDP. And at that point of what I'm identifying as Q sub F, all the resources in the economy have been utilized. The economy is fully employed. And once it's fully employed, we can't squeeze out any more output, and so the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical at that point. Now where it becomes vertical, we call that long run aggregate supply. So long run aggregate supply is where the economy reaches full employment and sellers cannot produce any more output because all of the resources have been employed. Alright, so the aggregate supply curve is up sloping, then it becomes vertical. Now, the aggregate supply curve can be thought of, particularly this short run aggregate supply curve portion, it can be thought of as the collection of all individual market supply curves. So you take all those market supply curves, mesh them together, but then you add a dose of reality by saying, okay, those sellers can only produce to the extent we have resources, and once those resources are utilized, fully utilized, the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical. So at full employment, output can't change, real GDP can't change. The only thing that can change is the price level. Now, I also need to mention that the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve can shift. For example, if the entire aggregate supply curve moves to the right, both the short run and the long run segments, if they move to the right, that's called an increase in aggregate supply. If they move to the left, it's called a decrease. Now, as they're moving, there's one interesting thing to observe. As they move to the right, as it moves to the right, our definition of full employment will change. As it moves to the left, our definition of full employment will change. So full employment should be looked at as kind of not a stationary target, but a target that can change. Because there could be new resource discoveries, there could be innovative ways of doing things that allow us to squeeze more out of existing resources, or maybe we've overestimated the amount of resources we thought were in existence, and the actual amount of resources could be fewer. So our definition of full employment can change, and it will change in response to the aggregate supply curve shifting left or right. The aggregate demand curve also can shift. If it shifts to the right, it's called an increase in aggregate demand. If it shifts to the left, it's called a decrease. And there are many factors that will make the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve shift. Okay. Now, again, I want to reiterate the difference between short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. The short-run aggregate supply reflects the fact that increasing rates of real GDP growth are going to be associated with higher price levels. That is, as we tap into those even more scarce resources, it's going to make them more valuable. Costs will go up, price will rise. And long-run aggregate supply is where the economy reaches full employment. There are no more resources currently to devote to productive activity, and so the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical in the long run. Alright, so if you take the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve and put them together, you can create cases, and these cases will allow us to look at what is called changing macroeconomic equilibrium. It's very reminiscent of the game we played in chapter 3, where we put the demand curve and supply curve together and studied changing market equilibrium, where you had a series of cases. Like from chapter 3, we had demand-induced cases where only the demand curve would shift. We had supply-induced cases where only the supply curve would shift. We had combination cases where both curves would shift. And we had the indeterminate cases where both curves would shift, but some critical information was missing, and we couldn't determine what happened to either price or quantity. You play the exact same game in chapter 9. So the aggregate demand curve can shift, the aggregate supply curve can shift, and it will create changes in what we call macroeconomic equilibrium. And let's look at several cases just to see how that works, and hopefully you'll see rather quickly that it's just kind of the same mechanical game we played in chapter 3. It's just we're playing it at the economy level. So let's take a look. And so to play this game, we take the game of changing macroeconomic equilibrium. You take the aggregate demand curve, which I depicted here, and I'm only going to focus on the short-run aggregate supply portion of the aggregate supply curve, because that's where all the action takes place. As you move from point to point on the short-run aggregate supply, the level of real GDP can change. So that's the action we want to focus on for the moment. Now, where the two curves intersect, it gives us the point of macroeconomic equilibrium. And so where the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve intersect, it will correspond to an equilibrium price level and an equilibrium level of real GDP. Now, what's interesting here, because we're studying the economy, is that when there's a change in macroeconomic equilibrium, if the price level goes up as a result, that's indicative of inflation. So in this model for the economy, we can identify inflation when the price level goes up. When that price level goes down, it's a sign of deflation. And concerning real GDP, if there's a change in macroeconomic equilibrium and real GDP increases, that's a sign of economic growth. If real GDP decreases, it's a sign that the economy is experiencing recessionary conditions. So the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve, when they shift, it's going to cause changes in macroeconomic concepts that we've been discussing, like inflation or economic growth, and so we can detect those things in our economy model. Let's look at a series of cases. Let's look at what I'll call example 1. And in example 1, we have a case here. We have a case where we have only the aggregate demand curve shifting, which is what I would call an aggregate demand induced case. And in this particular case, the way only the aggregate demand curve will shift, and there were a series of some 11 factors that we looked at on the aggregate demand side. 11 out of 11 billion factors that we looked at that would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift. And so the way this game is played is you're given a factor. Let's say, for example, that wealth increases. So in this particular case, wealth increases. And of course, when wealth increases, that causes consumption to increase. And when consumption gets bigger, aggregate demand gets bigger. And so a change in an aggregate demand factor will make only the aggregate demand curve shift. So in this case, if wealth goes up, aggregate demand increases, the curve shifts to the right. Our equilibrium price level will go up, and the equilibrium level of real GDP will also increase. So here you have a combination of higher price level, which will give us inflation, coupled with a higher level of real GDP, which gives us economic growth. So here you have inflation coupled with economic growth in response to the increase in aggregate demand. Now specifically, the type of inflation that we're identifying here is demand pull. And so whenever the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right and it pulls up the price level, that is graphically a depiction of what we talked about in the inflation material called demand pull inflation. So an increase in aggregate demand contributes to demand pull inflation. So any factor that would make the aggregate demand curve shift left or right would be a aggregate demand induced case, and there are 22 possibilities because those 11 factors that we discussed could increase or they could decrease. So please study those factors carefully because I have a lot of latitude when it comes to depicting aggregate demand induced cases. Alright, another example is where all the action takes place on the aggregate supply side, and when only the aggregate supply curve shifts, it's called an aggregate supply induced case. And we talked about a few factors, not very many, 3 I believe, that would cause the aggregate supply curve to shift only. Cost of resources, technology, and supply shocks. And so you want to be comfortable with how, when those few factors change, how they make the aggregate supply curve shift left or right. To illustrate, let's say that we're told that throughout the economy, domestic resource prices are going up. So you have a cost increase in the cost of resources. If cost of resources go up, aggregate supply is going to go down. So aggregate supply will decrease. Right? A decrease in aggregate supply means the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. As it shifts to the left, our equilibrium point goes from P sub E1 to P sub E2. So the price level will go up, which is a sign of inflation, and the level of real GDP will drop from Q sub E1 to Q sub E2. So you have a combination of inflation coupled with recession when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. So any of those factors that makes the aggregate supply curve shift to the left will create this graphical outcome. Now interestingly, because I focused on resources, the type of inflation that's depicted here is called cost push inflation. The higher resource costs are pushing up the price level, and so the type of inflation depicted here is cost push. Right? So the aggregate supply curve can shift left, it can shift right. As it does, by definition of macroeconomic equilibrium will change, as will the combination of price level movements and real GDP movements. A third example is from the category of combination cases, where you have here both a change in aggregate demand coupled with a change in aggregate supply. And let's look at a scenario. Let's say we're told that interest rates are falling throughout the economy and that also adverse supply shocks are increasing. Now, if interest rates fall, we know that's going to make investment go up. If the investment gets bigger, aggregate demand will increase. So aggregate demand will shift to the right. If you have adverse supply shocks occurring more frequently, that will cause aggregate supply to decrease. So the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. So the combination of these two factors, the lower interest rates will make aggregate demand go up. Adverse supply shocks increasing will make aggregate supply go down. So the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Now there's a caveat that has to be imposed in a combination case to give us precision, and the caveat is that the decrease in supply is greater than the increase in demand. And what that means is that the aggregate supply curve will shift more to the left, decreasing, then the aggregate demand curve shift to the right, increasing. And so if I graphically depict that, my equilibrium point is going to move from P sub E1 to P sub E2. And at P sub E2, I see that price level goes up, which is a sign of inflation, and real GDP falls, which is a sign of recession. So this particular scenario would give me an inflation recession outcome. Now combination cases are pretty extensive because there are 11 factors that can make the aggregate demand curve shift. There are 3 factors that can make the aggregate supply curve shift, and so any combination of those could translate into a very legitimate combination case. So I would work with the combination cases because they do tend to be my favorite when it comes to examination. So make sure you can depict any scenario where there's a change in the aggregate demand side and a change in the aggregate supply side simultaneously. Alright, last case we'll look at, which is also another combination case. Let's say we're told that there's a more liberal ideology occurring throughout government, and also technology is improving in the economy. Now, when government becomes more liberal, that means that government will increase, government spending will increase, aggregate demand will increase. An increase in technology throughout the economy will cause aggregate supply to increase. So these two factors will cause aggregate demand and aggregate supply to increase. So both curves will shift to the right. Again, because this is a combination case, we impose a caveat, and the caveat is that the increase in aggregate demand will equal the increase in aggregate supply. So both curves will shift to the right an equal amount. So the increase in aggregate supply is matched by an increase in aggregate demand. As a result, our equilibrium point is going to shift from Q sub E1 over to Q sub E2. It's going to be a parallel shift. And as a result, the real GDP will increase, which is a sign of economic growth, but the price level stays the same. So here you'd have a combination of price stability, the price level not changing, coupled with economic growth. This is a wonderful scenario because we achieve two goals at the same time. We have the economy growing, but yet we also have prices stable, which is a wonderfully desirable combination. So this is just another example of a combination case where both curves shift. We have precise information to determine how they shift relative to each other, and from that we can determine how macroeconomic equilibrium changes. Alright, so this is a quick recap of chapter 9. Again, as we hopefully you see very quickly that the mechanics of this chapter are very similar to the mechanics of chapter 3. The significant difference being that in chapter 3 we focused on a market. In chapter 9 we're looking at all markets simultaneously because we're studying the economy. Alright, so spend a lot of time on those factors because they do tend to show up on exam 2 in terms of these cases. Make sure you know how, when the factors change, how aggregate demand will be affected, if applicable, or how aggregate supply will be affected. Alright, so that's the material, the main material for chapter 9. Please remember that for the exam, you are to turn into me the problems at the end of chapter 9 over this material so that I can see that you've been working hard and that your exam scores will reflect that. Alright, until the next lecture, take care.